The deeper one looks into the archives of the Second World War, the more the shadows lengthen. Behind the headlines of battles won and treaties signed lies a darker ledger, one never meant for public release. Stamped most secret and hidden for decades, these files whisper of negotiations that betrayed allies, experiments that defied morality, and decisions made in smoke-filled war rooms that calculated human suffering as strategy. The documents themselves bear the marks of censorship, thick black lines of redaction, missing pages, and signatures scrawled hastily before being buried in steel cabinets. This is not the war of clean victories and noble causes, but of concealed bargains, silenced atrocities, and forbidden truths. The very language of the files feels like a warning, urging silence, punishing disclosure. And yet, here they resurface, pieces of a puzzle too disturbing to remain hidden. What you are about to hear is not myth or rumor, but fragments of history deliberately erased, resurfacing at last like a voice from a sealed crypt. These are the secrets of a war that never ended, because its buried truths still reverberate through our world today. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Pact of 1940. The year is 1940. Europe stands on the edge of complete collapse. Poland has already been carved apart. France has fallen with shocking speed, and Britain clings to survival under nightly bombardment. On the surface, the world appears polarized into absolute camps. Allied versus Axis, democracy versus tyranny. But within the vaults of foreign ministries and intelligence headquarters, another reality unfolds. It is a reality of whispered negotiations, coded telegrams, and quiet meetings in smoke-filled rooms, far from the eyes of soldiers dying on the front. This was the reality of a pact so dangerous that even the victors of the war buried every trace of it. In documents once stamped "Most Secret, Destroy if Compromised," it is referred to simply as the Northern Arrangement. Today, historians call it the Forbidden Pact of 1940. At the heart of this hidden chapter were the back-channels linking Nazi Germany to representatives moving discreetly through neutral Scandinavia. Stockholm, with its veneer of neutrality, became the setting for meetings that should never have existed. German Abwehr officers, spies operating under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, arrived under diplomatic cover. Across the table sat emissaries whose allegiances remained deliberately obscured, shielded by code names and erased archives. Their conversations extended beyond ceasefires or border disputes. They spoke of the division of entire regions, particularly the oil-rich territories of the Middle East, then loosely held under British and French control. To divide the Middle East in advance of conquest was to gamble with the very balance of the modern world. Oil was the bloodstream of war, and whoever held it would dictate the outcome of the next decade. One memo, dated December 14, 1940, and recovered from a British SIS archive decades later, references guarantees of supply and future demarcation of access routes through Syria and Persia. The names are struck out, replaced with black bars of censorship, but the language remains chilling. It speaks of barter, of human lives and sovereign nations traded like currency in exchange for influence and advantage. Intelligence officers from Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, monitoring Swedish communications, intercepted fragments of these exchanges. But rather than expose them to the public, the documents were classified under the highest secrecy. They bore the stamp, "For Prime Minister's eyes only." Winston Churchill himself is rumoured to have read them and then ordered them sealed. To reveal them would have shattered fragile alliances and exposed hypocrisy on all sides. Why such secrecy? Because the pact did not implicate Germany alone. Evidence suggests that some Allied-linked representatives, operating without official sanction but under quiet acknowledgement, entertained the possibility of using German power against the Soviet Union. The ideological hatred between Berlin and Moscow was no secret, and many in the West quietly wished for a collision that would leave both weakened. In such calculations, the lives of Poles, Czechs, or Yugoslavs were expendable, their nations treated as mere pieces on a shifting board. The Forbidden Pact reveals this brutal arithmetic, the willingness to bend moral lines if it meant weakening a rival. Official histories cast the Allied cause as one of unshakable moral clarity, yet these buried files tell another story. The war was not only fought against tyranny, it was manipulated as an opportunity to redraw empires, even as bombs fell on London and Coventry. The archives of the American OSS, later absorbed into the CIA, contain additional fragments. In one decrypted cable, codenamed Black Eagle 7, there is mention of economic security zones in the Levant. The date, January 1941, mere months before Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Analysts reviewing the cable, decades later, concluded that the discussions may have included tacit assurances that Germany would not threaten certain Western colonial holdings if given space to expand eastward. Such a bargain, if true, was never honored, but the mere existence of the proposal is damning. It suggests that even at the darkest moment of Nazi aggression, some voices in the West were calculating not how to stop it, but how to shape it to their advantage. The secrecy around the Forbidden Pact extended into the Cold War. When West Germany was rebuilt as an ally against the Soviet Union, there was no incentive to unearth documents that might question its new legitimacy. Similarly, Britain and the United States, now presenting themselves as guardians of freedom, could not afford revelations that they had once considered carving up the Middle East in conversations with Hitler's agents. Thus the files remained sealed, stamped and re-stamped with new clearance labels as the decades passed. In some cases, entire folders disappeared. Researchers who filed requests for access under Freedom of Information laws found pages missing, files mislabeled, or entire sections marked destroyed by accident. Yet, fragments survive, enough to piece together the outline of a pact that would have rewritten the map of the 20th century had it been fully executed. The emotional weight of these revelations is staggering. Imagine the soldiers of 1940 freezing in the snows of Finland or bleeding in the rubble of Rotterdam, believing they fought for principles that transcended politics. They could not have known that, in the shadows, their leaders weighed oil reserves and colonial influence against the value of their sacrifice. Imagine the families in Coventry or Warsaw who endured nights of bombing, while in Stockholm, men in tailored suits discussed whether Persia's pipelines would be allocated to Berlin or London. It was not just a betrayal of nations, it was a betrayal of faith. A faith in the notion that some wars are fought for justice, rather than convenience. What remains of the Forbidden Pact of 1940 is a puzzle missing half its pieces, yet the surviving fragments demand attention. They remind us that history is not only the story of battles, but of bargains. And the bargains made in secret often determine the fate of millions. Officially, the Forbidden Pact never existed. No treaty was signed, no declaration made. But the discussions themselves, silent, suppressed, and almost erased, expose the raw truth of geopolitics. Nations will barter even in the face of annihilation. Allies will betray ideals if the map promises them advantage. And wars remembered as struggles of good against evil will always carry within them a darker truth. One hidden in vaults and marked with a single word: classified. Chapter 2: Operation Paperclip's Darkest Origins. By the closing months of 1943, while the world still burned with the violence of total war, American intelligence agencies were already preparing for the next conflict. They understood something deeply unsettling. The defeat of Nazi Germany was not the end, but merely the opening act of a struggle that would extend into the coming Cold War. Within the vaults of the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, an initiative began to take shape. Its working title was Project Overcast, though history would remember it under another name, Operation Paperclip. To the public, Paperclip became synonymous with German rocket scientists shepherded into America's space program. But the sanitized version conceals a darker reality. In its earliest conception, Paperclip was not about space. It was about weapons, nerve agents, experimental aviation, and biological warfare data extracted from the concentration camps. The program began not in 1945, after Germany's surrender, but 2 years earlier, while the Reich still fought desperately on multiple fronts. In dimly lit offices in Washington, memoranda were drafted under strict secrecy. A surviving document, dated October 22, 1943, bears the subject line: Retention and Transfer of Specialized Personnel. Its language is cold and clinical. German scientists are described not as men, but as assets, their value measured in formulas, patents, and the potential to shorten future wars. Already, lists of names were being compiled, often with the assistance of captured intelligence from Switzerland and Sweden, where German agents smuggled microfilm and blueprints across supposedly neutral borders. These files did not only include the engineers working under Werner von Braun at Peenemünde. They also catalogued physicians associated with Dachau's hypothermia experiments and Buchenwald's chemical testing facilities. Their inclusion is what gives Operation Paperclip its darkest shadow. It reveals that the Americans were prepared to protect war criminals, not out of ignorance, but by calculated design. As Allied armies advanced across France in 1944, OSS officers moved behind the front lines not only to seize documents but to make contact. In some cases, offers were extended before surrender. Safe passage in exchange for cooperation became the whispered bargain. A declassified cable from March 1945, coded Silver Dust Report, describes an American operative meeting with SS technical officers in Innsbruck. The exchange centered on tabun and sarin, two organophosphate nerve agents developed under the direction of chemist Gerhard Schrader. The SS promised formulas and production methods in exchange for immunity and relocation. Months later, several of those very chemists appeared in US custody under new identities, their past scrubbed from official records. The deception extended even to the highest levels of American leadership. President Harry Truman, when first briefed on Paperclip in 1945, specifically forbade the recruitment of individuals who were active members of the Nazi Party, or more than nominal participants in its enterprises. On paper, this directive held. In reality, documents were falsified, personnel files were cleaned, swastika memberships erased, SS ranks removed, and in some cases, entire biographies rewritten. Scientists who had overseen experiments on human beings were rebranded as mere laboratory researchers, their hands washed in the ink of bureaucratic deception. It was this process, attaching a sanitized paperclip to altered dossiers, that gave the project its enduring name. By 1946, Paperclip had accelerated. Military flights carried engineers and physicians into the United States under the cover of darkness, bypassing immigration law. Many were placed at Fort Bliss in Texas, others at Wright Field in Ohio, and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. Their expertise was eagerly absorbed into America's military-industrial complex. Von Braun and his team were assigned to rocket development, their V-2 designs forming the backbone of future intercontinental ballistic missiles. Less publicized was the dispersal of physicians into biological research laboratories, some linked to Fort Detrick, where America's germ warfare program took shape. Notes recovered decades later confirmed that experimental data from human subjects in Dachau, particularly on hypothermia and altitude, were not discarded, but carefully studied and replicated under US supervision. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, pursued its own version of Paperclip, codenamed Operation Oswiecim. In October 1946, Soviet troops forcibly relocated more than 2,000 German specialists into the USSR, including entire families. The competition for these human spoils of war became a shadow conflict of its own, with both superpowers racing to strip Germany of its intellectual wealth. The tragedy was that justice became secondary. Nuremberg condemned a handful of doctors and generals, but dozens more slipped through untouched, protected by their scientific value. Files show that American prosecutors deliberately omitted names from trial lists, knowing those individuals were already earmarked for recruitment. The ethical betrayal is stark. Families of camp victims testified at Nuremberg, describing experiments of unimaginable cruelty. Prisoners immersed in freezing water until death, dissected while still alive, or forced into exposure chambers to test chemical agents. These crimes were laid bare for the world, yet even as judges deliberated, some perpetrators were negotiating safe passage with American handlers. Immunity was granted, evidence sealed, and witnesses silenced by omission. The very trials meant to demonstrate the triumph of justice became, in part, an elaborate smokescreen concealing the transfer of knowledge. Declassified CIA memoranda from the 1950s shed further light. One file, codenamed Project Bluebird, details experiments into mind control and interrogation techniques, citing data originating from Central Europe, 1942-1944. The euphemistic phrasing hides its origins, but historians now link it to Dachau's chemical trials. Another memorandum references aviation medical data derived from high-altitude studies, source German origin. Such phrases were designed to obscure, not reveal, and yet their presence confirms that the data was used, that the human suffering it represented was quietly legitimized once transcribed into English-language reports. By the 1960s, Operation Paperclip had evolved beyond its wartime roots. The scientists it imported played central roles in America's arms race. They designed missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, advised on chemical warfare defenses, and contributed to space programs that carried men beyond Earth's atmosphere. When President John F. Kennedy declared the goal of reaching the moon, few Americans knew that the dream rested on the shoulders of men once sworn to Hitler. Von Braun himself became a celebrated figure, photographed beside presidents, his past discussed only in whispers. The darker names, those linked to medical atrocities, remained hidden altogether, their contributions buried in classified programs shielded from public scrutiny. What makes Operation Paperclip's origins so haunting is not simply the recruitment of scientists, but the timing. By beginning in 1943, while the Nazi regime still slaughtered millions, the Americans signaled their priorities with chilling clarity. They were preparing for the next war before the current one had ended. They were willing to protect perpetrators before the victims had even been buried. The justification was always the same: to deny the Soviets an advantage, to safeguard the West. Yet this pragmatic reasoning does not erase the moral compromise at its heart. Paperclip was not born from ignorance. It was born from calculation, a cold acknowledgement that justice could be postponed indefinitely if power was at stake. Today, the sanitized history of Operation Paperclip remains deeply embedded in American culture. The rockets, the satellites, the triumphs of NASA, all of these are celebrated chapters. But the origins, the hidden corridors of Project Overcast, and the smuggled documents from Dachau remain deliberately obscured. In dusty archives, fragments of memoranda still whisper of the bargains struck, the dossiers rewritten, and the men who should have faced trial, but instead boarded flights to freedom. For every sanitized biography, there lies a victim whose suffering was transformed into data and then into progress. This is the price of Paperclip's darkest origins, a price paid in silence and still carried in the shadows of history. Chapter 3: The Erased Atrocities of Unit 731. Harbin, Manchuria, in the 1930s and 1940s, was not simply a city under occupation. It was the beating heart of one of the most terrifying laboratories of death ever constructed. Unit 731, officially the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Imperial Japanese Army, outwardly presented itself as a scientific research division. In reality, it was a sprawling complex of human experimentation, biological weapons development, and systematic murder on a scale so grotesque that even hardened soldiers were disturbed by what they witnessed. The files that survive, many deliberately destroyed before Japan's surrender in August 1945, speak in clinical tones of what was, in truth, mass torture disguised as research. The victims were Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, and Allied captives alike. Men, women, and children disappeared into the compound's high brick walls and never returned. In documents recovered later by Soviet forces, victims were labeled not by name, but as Maruta, logs, an obscene euphemism that reduced human beings to fuel for experiments. The range of atrocities conducted within Unit 731 is staggering. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera. Others were exposed to frostbite, their limbs submerged in ice water until frozen solid, then shattered with blunt instruments to study tissue decay. In operating theatres, subjects were vivisected without anesthesia, their organs removed while still alive, to observe the progression of disease in real time. Pregnant women were deliberately infected, their fetuses dissected to monitor transmission. The cruelty was not incidental, it was institutional. General Shiro Ishii, the commanding officer, presented the work as vital to Japan's future military supremacy. His subordinates carried out the orders with the precision of bureaucrats, logging data, filing charts, and presenting reports as if they were medical professionals conducting ordinary research. The horror lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the methodical calm with which they were recorded. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Soviet troops advancing into Manchuria captured remnants of the Unit 731 facility. What they discovered stunned even seasoned investigators. Pits filled with charred remains, shattered equipment hastily abandoned, and laboratories still stinking of chemicals used in dissections. Yet even as evidence was gathered, much of the truth slipped away. Ishii ordered mass destruction of records in the final weeks of the war. Hundreds of documents were burned, test animals killed, and witnesses silenced. Still, Fragments survived, ledgers of prisoner transfers, half-burned reports, and coded telegrams referencing field trials conducted on villages in northern China. In one account, plague-infested fleas were released by low-flying aircraft, sparking outbreaks that ravaged civilian populations. These operations were test runs for biological warfare on a scale the world was not prepared to face. The Soviet Union held trials in Khabarovsk in December 1949, exposing some of Unit 731's crimes to the world. 12 captured Japanese officers stood accused of conducting biological warfare experiments. The proceedings revealed details too horrific to ignore, with testimony describing vivisections, poison gas chambers, and deliberate disease outbreaks. Yet in the West, these revelations were swiftly dismissed as communist propaganda. American authorities had their own reasons for silencing the truth. Declassified US Army records confirm that General Douglas MacArthur, then Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, struck a secret deal with Ishii and his top scientists. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, they would hand over their research data to the Americans. The justification, spelled out in memos stamped top secret, was clear. The United States feared Soviet advances in biological warfare and wanted to secure the knowledge for itself. Justice was sacrificed for strategic advantage. The immunity agreement effectively erased Unit 731 from Western memory. Unlike Nazi doctors tried at Nuremberg, Ishii and his colleagues lived out their post-war years in relative comfort. Some took positions in Japanese universities or medical corporations. Ishii himself reportedly lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959, never once standing in a courtroom. Meanwhile, the victims, tens of thousands of Chinese civilians, an unknown number of Soviet soldiers, and even Allied prisoners remained voiceless, their suffering buried under the weight of Cold War secrecy. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, as survivors came forward and local investigators pieced together fragments, did the enormity of Unit 731 begin to re-enter historical consciousness. Even then, full acknowledgement has remained elusive, particularly in Japan, where official apologies have been slow and partial at best. The most chilling aspect of this erasure lies in the way Unit 731's data was assimilated into US and Soviet research programs. Files marked "From Ishii Report" appeared in classified projects at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the heart of America's biological warfare research. Soviet scientists, too, incorporated findings from captured Japanese officers into their own programs. The knowledge gained from thousands of murdered prisoners was transformed into statistics, charts, and formulas. In this way, the atrocities continued to echo long after the war, their scientific results shaping Cold War weapons development. The victims' bodies were destroyed, but their suffering lived on in data locked inside classified vaults. What makes Unit 731's story so haunting is not only the scale of its crimes, but the deliberate choice to suppress them. Nations that proclaimed themselves defenders of justice chose instead to weaponize atrocity. The truth was sacrificed to strategy, morality to expediency. And so, for decades, the world was told that Unit 731 was a rumor, a fabrication, or an exaggeration. Meanwhile, survivors bore the scars in silence while perpetrators walked free. To this day, many records remain sealed, either in US archives or hidden within Japan's own bureaucracies. Historians who request access encounter redactions, missing files, or simple denials. Yet the fragments that have surfaced are damning enough. They describe a nightmare hidden behind walls of brick and silence. A nightmare that governments agreed must never fully be exposed. As the declassified evidence makes clear, Unit 731 was not merely a Japanese crime. It was an international betrayal. The victims were erased not only by those who killed them, but by those who shielded the killers. The story of Unit 731 is therefore not only about cruelty, but about silence. The silence of governments, the silence of official history, and the silence imposed upon survivors. When we speak of the erased atrocities of Unit 731, we are speaking not only of the horror that occurred in Harbin, but of the calculated decision to bury it. And that decision, more than anything else, reveals the darkest secret of all. That the truth of war is not only written in blood, but also in the black ink of censorship, in the classified stamp, and in the locked vault where memory itself is forbidden. Chapter 4. Churchill's Hidden Bombing Calculations. Among the most heavily guarded secrets of the British War Cabinet lies a series of memoranda stamped with the chilling designation "Most Restricted." For decades, The official narrative of Britain's bombing campaigns in the Second World War portrayed them as acts of grim necessity, responses to German aggression, tactical strikes against industrial targets, and symbols of defiance in the nation's darkest hour. Yet in documents only recently declassified, another picture emerges, one that places Winston Churchill himself at the center of decisions, calculated not merely to defeat the enemy, but to incinerate its civilian population. These papers, drafted between 1942 and 1944, contain not only strategic evaluations, but also cold numerical projections of death tolls. Phrased with bureaucratic detachment, they refer to Hamburg and Cologne not as cities, but as centers of morale stability, their reduction described as psychological warfare by combustion, the sanitized image of Britain's wartime leadership, the noble guardian of democracy, begins to collapse under the weight of these revelations. The most notorious example is Dresden, bombed in February 1945, leaving tens of thousands dead in firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Officially, the strike was justified as an effort to disrupt German troop movements. But buried within RAF bomber command files is a memorandum dated January 25, 1945, less than 3 weeks before the attack. It projects the destruction ratio of Dresden's urban center, estimating civilian casualties in excess of 20,000. Language is stripped of emotion. Projected, incineration consistent with morale reduction objectives. This was not collateral damage, it was deliberate design, and Dresden was not unique. As early as 1943, during Operation Gomorrah against Hamburg, planners calculated that prolonged bombing with both high explosives and incendiaries would create a firestorm capable of overwhelming the city's defenses. The result was 37,000 dead in a single week, their bodies reduced to ash in streets that once carried ordinary lives. The calculations behind these raids reveal the cold mechanics of strategic bombing. Architects of the policy, including Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, known as Bomber Harris, argued relentlessly for area bombing, the deliberate targeting of dense civilian quarters. Churchill, though occasionally voicing hesitation in public, consistently signed off on plans presented with the right blend of military jargon and strategic necessity. In one handwritten note, later discovered among his personal files, Churchill wrote, "The destruction of the enemy's cities is the only way to break his will." These words were never meant for public ears, never read in Parliament or broadcast in his speeches. They remained hidden, tucked inside folders with red seals, classified for decades to prevent public outrage. The bombing campaign was presented to the British people as retaliation, an answer to the blitz that had terrorized London, Coventry, and other cities in 1940 and 1941. Yet the scale and intensity of Britain's response exceeded mere reprisal. The files reveal a systematic doctrine of urban incineration. Cities like Essen, Dortmund, and Kassel were chosen not for military installations, but for the density of their housing, the vulnerability of their working-class quarters, and the likelihood of fires spreading uncontrollably. Charts plotted wind patterns, fuel supplies, and the distribution of water reserves, all designed to maximize the effect. Civilians became variables in an equation, their deaths predicted, tabulated, and ultimately accepted as strategic cost. The coldest phrase repeated across several memos is morale attrition factor. This was the true objective, to terrorize Germany into surrender by reducing its people to ash and rubble. Perhaps the most disturbing revelations involve the suppression of dissent within Britain itself. Several members of Parliament and clergy voiced concern as early as 1943, questioning whether the bombing of entire civilian districts was morally defensible. One letter from the Bishop of Chichester pleaded that Britain not descend to the level of the barbarian. These objections reached the War Cabinet but were quietly filed away, marked for internal circulation only. The RAF's own records show that even some pilots and navigators expressed unease, aware that their bombs were not striking military targets, but homes, hospitals, and schools. Yet their voices too were silenced, their doubts erased from official accounts. Instead, the narrative was shaped by triumphant communiques celebrating the crippling of enemy industry, even when industrial zones remained untouched while residential areas burned. After the war, the morality of strategic bombing became a subject of controversy. The Nuremberg trials condemned indiscriminate attacks against civilians, yet no Allied leader was ever brought to account for the firestorms unleashed on Germany. The The Dresden raid in particular provoked outrage, with even some Allied generals privately questioning its necessity. But Churchill, ever the master of rhetoric, distanced himself when criticism mounted. In March 1945, he issued a memorandum claiming he wished to review the policy of bombing cities, suggesting a pivot to purely military targets. Yet the timing betrayed him. By then, Germany was already collapsing, and his distancing appeared less a moral awakening than a political maneuver to shield himself from historical judgment. The earlier documents, those stamped most restricted, show that he had been fully aware of the strategy's true purpose all along. The concealment of these calculations lasted well into the Cold War. Britain, eager to present its wartime leadership as morally unblemished, kept the most damning records sealed. Historians requesting access in the 1950s and 1960s were denied, told that files were misplaced or awaiting review. It was only in the late 20th century, as archives slowly opened, that the full scope of the bombing program became undeniable. Even then, sanitization persisted. Official histories spoke of regrettable civilian losses rather than deliberate design. Only a handful of scholars, piecing together fragments from multiple archives, exposed the systematic nature of the campaign. Their work painted a portrait not of defensive necessity, but of offensive terror, orchestrated from the highest levels of government. The human toll defies comprehension. In Hamburg, families were incinerated in bomb shelters as oxygen was consumed by the firestorm above. In Dresden, the heat was so intense that asphalt bubbled in the streets, trapping those who tried to flee. Eyewitness accounts describe mothers clutching children who melted into their arms, bodies reduced to unrecognizable forms. Yet these realities are absent from the sanitized memoranda. There, civilians are referred to as non-combatant elements, or morale units. The transformation of human lives into statistics is perhaps the most haunting betrayal of all. The very leaders who spoke of liberty and humanity in public had, in private, reduced those values to ashes in pursuit of victory. The story of Churchill's hidden bombing calculations forces us to confront a truth that official history has long resisted. The Second World War, often remembered as the Good War, was also a war of shadows, of decisions made behind closed doors that blurred the line between strategy and atrocity. Churchill remains a symbol of defiance, his speeches echoing across generations. Yet the documents hidden in war cabinet archives remind us that even symbols can cast long shadows. The firestorms that consumed German cities were not accidents of war. They were the result of deliberate, calculated choices. Choices that leaders never intended the public to know. Choices buried under layers of secrecy until time itself threatened to erase them. To speak of Britain's finest hour is to remember both the courage of resistance and the darkness concealed in its vaults, where human lives were reduced to numbers and cities became experiments in terror by fire. The archives have spoken, but they have not spoken fully. What remains sealed is often more telling than what has been revealed. The Forbidden Pact of 1940, the earliest roots of Operation Paperclip, the erased atrocities of Unit 731, and Churchill's hidden bombing calculations. Each file exposes a fragment of truth, and yet each is surrounded by missing pages, vanished witnesses, and deliberate silence. These are not just relics of a past war, but living reminders that the lines between morality and expediency blur whenever nations face annihilation. For every document declassified, another remains locked away. For every truth revealed, another is withheld in the name of national security. The question that lingers is not only what was done, but what remains hidden even now. How many other files lie buried beneath layers of secrecy, stamped most secret and forgotten in steel cabinets? The shadows of the Second World War stretch long, and the voices silenced within them may yet resurface. The war may have ended in 1945, but its forbidden truths remain unresolved, haunting the present like an echo we are still forbidden to hear.